All right, well, welcome everyone. If you want to have a seat, we'll go ahead and get started today. Thanks for coming. It's a great turnout and a great turnout on the phone. Thanks folks on the phone for your patience. This is the first time that we've provided this both by WebEx, and we're also working on trying to record it so that we can archive it. So we're kind of jettisoning ourselves into the 21st century here. So even though this has typically been a local seminar, we really have some great folks in the area that's doing work on some really neat things that we would like to share more broadly. So this is the Interaction of Society and Environment seminar series. It's been going on for quite some time, and it's a collaborative partnership with Colorado State University, the U.S. Forest Service, USGS, and now Fish and Wildlife Service. So today our topic is communicating climate change, perspectives from working with federal agencies. And we have three speakers from three different entities, and I'd like to introduce them, and then I'll let them each get started. Each speaker will give their presentation, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions in between each talk, and then we'll also have an opportunity for a bit of a panel discussion at the end there. So our first speaker is Angie Richmond. She's a climate change specialist with the Climate Change Response Program with the Park Service. And she's actually been with the Park Service for 15 years, has been a frontline interpreter. She's worked at 9 parks, 1 regional office, and now in the Washington office here in Fort Collins. She has a degree in astrophysics, which is way cool, and she works in outreach and education. So she really is bridging that gap between science and outreach and education. And our second speaker will be Sean Davis, and Sean is a PhD student and instructor at in the Human Dimensions and Natural Resource Department here at CSU.
Melanie Crafty, Sequoia National Park.
And he works on place-based education strategies for communicating climate change, both with the National Park System and the National Wildlife Refuge System. And he also has interest in technical innovations for on-site techniques for surveying, such as using tablets for getting information from folks in parks and refuges. And lastly, we have Aaliyah Beach. She's a social science researcher with the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, and she's currently leading the National Visitor Survey for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, and also working on other refuge-related research. And she's also a PhD student in the Human Dimensions and Natural Resource Program, has a background in forestry and wildlife, as well as Human Dimensions and Natural Resources. And her studies at CSU involve human wildlife conflict and values. So we'll start with Sean. And I'll just do a quick check-in to make sure that everyone on the phone can hear okay. I guess if somebody is having difficulty, could they just speak up? Great. And then folks on the phone, if you could just put your phone on mute, that'd be wonderful. And then after each presentation, if you want, we'll check in with you if you want to ask questions, as well as the audience here.
All right, good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Good. Excellent. I'm not Angie Richmond. If you're paying attention to the order, I'm Sean Davis. I'll be speaking first. I'm talking about place-based climate change and national parks and national wildlife refuges. What we did is have a study that went on in 2011 in which we researched 16 different parks and wildlife refuges, looking at visitors, different parks personnel, things of that nature, to find out what was going on in communicating climate change and what were visitors looking for climate change communication. How could we put all that information together to create the best climate change communication that we could have at these different venues? And we were looking at it from a place-based perspective. So some of the different areas we went to, you see the map here with all these stars on it. We were up in the Pacific Northwest in the Puget Sound area, looking at a number of different parks and refuges up there, including the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge, as well as Dungeness, Olympic National Park, Mount Rainier, and North Cascades. We're also up in Alaska here at Kenai Fjord National Park, the National Wildlife Refuge. In the center there, of course, Colorado, Rocky Mountain National Park, and Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. Down in southern Florida there, in Everglades, Biscayne, Key Deer National Wildlife Refuge, as well as 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge. We had to go there in the winter during January. It was really rough doing research on the Florida Keys during that time. We were also over there in D.C. looking at urban parks, such as Harpers Ferry National Historic Park, Prince William Forest National Forest Park, and National Capitol East Park. So the reason we were in all these areas, we've come from a number of different research from looking at what the parks personnel, the refuge personnel want to do as far as a geographic range, as you can see, that we were able to establish, as well as that urban, rural kind of between range that we wanted to have as well to see the different effects of climate change. These were also chosen, all these sites, because they had visible aspects of climate change that visitors could see at each of those sites. Those were kind of the criteria for why we went to these different areas. So I mentioned that this is the place-based climate change engagement program. What is place-based engagement? Well, if you imagine going to a park or going to a national wildlife refuge, you're going with an interpretive guide with a group of people discussing what you're seeing, interpreting the landscape, and having it interpreted for you in various ways. That's pretty much what it is. You're in a central place, a location with others, and a knowledgeable guide, and discussing what you're seeing and connecting with that place. So how does this help people understand climate change? Well, there's a number of different ways that this happens. Audiences are connected with places. This goes back to that theory of place attachment. They connect with, or they have these unique bonds, and they build kind of emotional connections to specific landscapes, especially iconic, beautiful areas such as the national parks and national wildlife refuges. Secondly, studies show that participants learn very well when they have active learning as opposed to passive learning. Those active hands-on learning experiences really facilitate greater learning and more memorable learning over time. Finally, people will remember lessons and adopt new behaviors when they feel a sense of responsibility and have knowledge of the consequences of things that could be going on in these certain places. So going back to this project, what did we actually do in all these places besides going to the Keys in the wintertime and enjoying Alaska during the summer? Well, we were doing a lot of good work there. We were talking with agency staff and partners. We actually did a survey with over 800 different agency staff and partners to get their perspective of their visitors' understanding of climate change. We visited all the sites and had focus groups at each of these sites with the different managers, some of the nonprofits in the area, to get their perspective of what's going on in those individual sites. We hosted World Cafe workshops in each of the regions to bring the different parks and refuges together in one room at one time to actually discuss what they were seeing, what hopes they had for the future of communication and climate change in those areas. Finally, in the visitor side, this is where my expertise comes in with this project. We looked at over 4,000 visitor surveys, and we interviewed about 350 visitors for their perceptions of climate change communication and climate change in itself at the different parks and refuges. So what did we find out from our conversations with these agency partners? Well, currently they're doing a lot for climate change. Over 18% of them were looking at formal education programs and designing formal education programs focused on climate change. They're hosting workshops and meetings to discuss climate change communication in the parks and refuges. And, of course, they were putting out publications about climate change in the parks and the refuges for communication. We identified a number of barriers and opportunities that overlapped at all of these areas. There was a lack of connections to people's everyday lives. So climate change wasn't being made relevant to people. That was one of the big barriers that came out. Also, they found that their visitors seemed apathetic, they didn't believe it, or they were disinterested in the subject of climate change when they were visiting these parks and refuges. And that finally there was this lack of urgency or immediacy, that they didn't really have this idea that something needed to be done now. However, we also identified a number of really good opportunities that existed at the parks and refuges, such as educating youth early and often, focusing on these local visible effects. That was one of the big powers of communication that was evident at all of these sites, is that they had these visible effects that people could actually see and discuss. And then finally, there was this large potential for collaboration and partnership support overall. So, looking at the results of the staff and visitor surveys, again, with the agency staff, we had over 800 different staff surveys with a pretty equal break among the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service. This was done online. We had online surveys go out to see what they felt about climate change and their visitor communication aspects of climate change. Then there were the visitor surveys. Again, we had over 4,000, mainly in the national parks, but we still had a representative sample in the National Wildlife Refuges as well. And then we have a kind of a demographic breakdown here. What we're seeing is a lot of highly educated white individuals visiting these places. So we wanted to connect all the things we were finding out with the visitor surveys to more national surveys of understanding of climate change. How many people are familiar with the Global Warming 6 America study? Oh, wow. Excellent. So you know that they're doing national polls to kind of segment the American population into 6 different categories of how they believe in climate change. In 2011, the 6 America's Climate Change Study had results that looked like this. You had 12% in the alarmed category, and again, those alarmed people are the ones who believe climate change is happening, they know it's happening, and they want to do something about it. They want to take action on this. All the way down to the other end where you see the dismissive, these are people who know climate change is not happening. They're vehemently against it, and they don't think we should do anything about it. Then you have the people in the middle there, the cautious and disengaged, who are somewhat apathetic about the climate change issue as a whole. Now, when we did our visitor study, we included a number of different questions off of the 6 America study so that we could compare our results with the 6 America results. We wanted to see if there was difference in the visitors to national parks and national wildlife refuges as far as their considerations and beliefs about climate change as the rest of the national public. And here's what we found. As you can see, we have a much larger degree of alarmed participants within the national parks and national wildlife refuge visitor population. A little bit less concerned and cautious just because of that big move toward the alarm, and then less disengaged and dismissive as well. So what this is showing us is that we're dealing with a completely different population, one that wants to know what they can do about climate change. They're ready for action. They're ready for behavioral shift, and that is a large population in the alarmed category. We also, talking about the place-based part of this study, wanted to see how attached individuals were to these different areas. And as you can see, when we surveyed most visitors, they are either strongly attached, detached, or somewhat attached by a very large degree. Over 90% fall into that, somewhere in the range of attached category, showing that they have these emotional connections to the park, that they find that this park is important to protect. Many times in many other studies, this idea of place attachment has led to kind of place protection in a sense, that people who are more attached to areas want to take an active role in protecting those areas. So, we wanted to see if staff, for one, saw some of the different changes in the national parks and national wildlife refuges. Could they see the physical changes of climate change there? And overwhelmingly, they're saying, yes, definitely, we can see these changes. That's what that 71% is there. Most managers, most workers and staff at the park are saying they can see all of these changes due to climate change. Curiously, we wanted to see if visitors were seeing those changes as well. And what we found out, that visitors weren't seeing them quite as much as the staff, but they were still, to a large degree, seeing these changes of climate change. They were getting the message. Now, some of these visitors, about half, had only been to the park one time, so it starts to wonder, well, how are they seeing the changes if they're only there once? But the idea is they've seen indication of these changes through photos, pictures, or interpretive programs that elicited these changes to them. But overall, they're seeing these changes at the park. So we asked staff of these areas, are your visitors concerned about climate change? And what we found out is the staff said that they're not really that concerned. They're either slightly concerned or somewhat concerned, but they're certainly not extremely concerned about climate change. We only got about 1% of the staff saying that. Mainly they're saying, slightly somewhat concerned, or maybe even not concerned. What's very, very interesting is we asked the visitors to these areas the exact same question. Are you concerned about climate change? So I guess it's not the exact same question. But we wanted to find out if the visitors were concerned about climate change. And here's what we found out. The visitors are extremely concerned or very concerned about climate change. They have a much larger percentage of concern than the agency staff was thinking they had. This is huge news for how we're communicating and what we're communicating to the visitors of these areas. It is obvious that they are concerned and maybe they even want to learn more about climate change. So we also asked, okay, you want to learn more about climate change, you're concerned about it, but should the National Park, should the National Wildlife Refuge Agency be the ones to be talking about that? Should they be communicating about climate change? When we asked agency staff about this, they said that, yes, most definitely, we should be communicating about climate change. This is an important issue. This is changing the landscape of these places. We need to communicate about it. So we asked visitors the same question. Should the National Parks Agency and should the National Wildlife Refuge Agency be communicating about climate change? And what we found out was very similar results. They say yes, overall, that they should be communicating about that as well. That is what they want to learn about. So how do they want to learn? Well, what we found out is we gave visitors a choice of about 16 different options of how they would like to learn about climate change from normal venues of learning in parks and wildlife refuges. And the top 5 are shown here. Films, videos, movies, coming in number 5. Of course, we had some of the trailside indoor exhibits, printed materials, but number 1 was very surprising. Every time we show this slide and we talk about this result, agency staff, refuge staff think it's going to be the interpretive guides that are the way that people want to learn. But most people are now saying they want to learn about climate change at these places through the website. That's good news. That's a whole different way of communicating about this that we didn't think would be the way visitors would want to learn. So again, that's 46% of the visitors that we interviewed selected this. So, all of this is great. Visitors want to learn about climate change. They want to hear from National Parks and National Wildlife Refuge representatives. But are they willing to do anything about it? Do they actually want to make changes in their behavior? So we asked visitors, would you be willing to change your behavior in this park or refuge to start to mitigate some of the effects of climate change? Here's what we found out. 29% were extremely willing, and 38% were very willing. That's nearly 70% of the population of visitors on this scale willing to do something about climate change. If you add in the somewhat, we're over about 90%, and then the ones who are slightly willing or not at all willing only make up about 9% of that population of visitors. What's interesting about this question is we specifically asked would they be willing to do something at these parks or refuges to make this change. In an earlier conversation we had with Tony Lazarowitz and Ed Medak, they suggested that this was the opportune way to actually start behavior change within the park. That if you could get them to do something at that place, such as taking the shuttle service or recycling and showing them how that was making a difference in climate change, it would be very effective. So, luckily, the visitors are willing to do these behavioral changes. So, other results that we found talking in the World Cafes with the different regions, representatives from parks and wildlife refuges in the different regions we are at, had a couple of target audiences they wanted to address. One was web audiences. They felt that they wanted to connect more with the web audiences. Second was the staff, getting their own staff involved in this climate change conversation and how to communicate it. And finally, children and youth audiences came up as the number 1 audience that they wanted to target. So what actions they actually wanted to promote, what do they want their audience to do? They want their audience first to know that they can make a difference. And this is going along with those messages of hope that are very important in climate change. They wanted them to understand those local examples and have that connection to place. Again, that connection to place is very important and powerful for getting people to adopt some of these behaviors. And then finally, appreciate they don't need to know everything about climate change to take action. The message here is that we know enough about climate change, we know the actions that will help to mitigate it, we can start on that today. So For effective engagement, how do we want to get this message across? Number one was telling local personal stories about the changing landscape. This involves getting people from the community together to actually discuss how climate change is changing the landscape and what that means for people there in that community near those parks and refuges. Second, utilizing the new technology and social media that is available now through websites, mobile apps, things like that, to get people plugged in and hooked into some of this new information. And then finally, creating citizen science programs. These are programs, of course, where citizens themselves can take part in the science and have that active participation in learning. So, how can we change this climate change conversation through the lenses of Places We Love? What would this look like on the ground if we were to adapt some of these things we're learning and put them into practice? Well, it would probably look something that my colleague Karina Mullen has been working on with some of the Alaska parks and refuges. What we're finding out is that people are seeing some of these different changes, but to have them more paramount as far as archival photos versus photos of today, or to see how things used to be historically and see how much they've changed, those are very powerful with participants. That came out time and time again in the interview data. I'm going to take you to a current pilot website that was developed to do this. This is called Understanding Landscape Change in Alaska. What this site has is a number of archival photos from the national parks that it is working with up in the southeastern corner of Alaska, southwestern corner, and looking at the different climate changes that occur there. And of course, it's got this neat little icon, camera, Carmen, to kind of guide you along the way. And how it works is not just seeing these photos, but it's involving citizens and participants actively into creating their own scientific website. So they are encouraged to take their own photos and compare them to some of the archival photos that they have here on the website. Let's take a look here at Teaneck Fjords. These are the different parks. There's 4 different parks within this complex. So as you can see, there's some drastic changes already that you can see from the different photos that they're displaying here. But what's really innovative about this website is the fact that you can go to any of these sites where they have photos already and click on them, and you can see the photo here of this glacier. This is the Northwestern Glacier and Teaneck Fjords National Park. And over there's nothing to compare it to. There's a camera. Well, what they do is they encourage visitors and participants to find out the longitude and latitude, as you can see in the details of this photo, and go take a picture in present day and upload this onto the website. Down here, there are places where they can comment on some of the differences they might see in these photos, and also they can load their photos and compare them to the photos that are up there. Not only that, but there's also connections to science. The different scientists on the ground doing these studies have contributed to this website and these different subjects below. If we wanted to go see glaciers, as you can see, there's a write-up about glacier studies, different glacier studies that are happening. There'll even in the future be links to actually perhaps videos and things of that nature that show the different glacier studies happening in progress. This places to comment and actually take a part of this science as well. So that is kind of where this research has led us into our thoughts of developing some new climate change communication campaigns for different parks and refuges. Are there any questions? Yes?
So is that website actually linked to the National Park website? Or was it actually the National Park website?
Yeah, so the question was, will that website be linked to the National Park Service website? Ideally, that is how it's going to work. There'll be links right on the National Park Service website that those parks are in, and they'll link it to this external website, or it'll be combined into one website on the Park Service. They're having some complications right now, and as far as the different language that the two web servers use. But I think by the end of the summer, I'm thinking they're trying to get that up and running. So, yes. Other questions? Yes.
So you asked visitors whether they'd be willing to change the English. Was specific examples given, or was it just that general question? Will you be willing to change?
There were no specific examples as far as if they could choose to take a shuttle, something like that. There was an example given in the question, such as taking the shuttle or recycling, to give them an idea of certain behaviors that would be available at those parks and refuges.
We consider all about bias, maybe that, people want to pay this, or we want to change the behavior. Or the old trick of asking, do you think your neighbor would be willing to change his or her behavior?
Yeah, so
Along that line.
the question of would people be saying that they're going to change behavior but not really do it? In the literature, there is that sort of discrepancy, and it varies in different studies, from behavioral intentions to the actual behavior. Studying actual behavior is quite tough, especially when you're dealing with visitors who might only be there once or twice in their whole lifetime. So we just had to go with behavioral intention in this case. But there is always that scenario that they'll say that they're going to do something but wouldn't really actually do it. In most studies, I think this is around like 20% from, loss on behavioral intention to actual behavior, depending on what they're actually putting out to do. Sure thing, thank you.
Alright, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? In the back? Am I loud enough for you guys? Okay, how about on the phone? Can you guys all hear me? Yeah, okay. I've had somebody answer. And I hate to start a presentation with an apology, but I used the Parks of Response from my PowerPoint, and they're not on this laptop, so the text is not going to be as pretty as I would have liked, but you should still be able to read it. So again, I'm Angie Richmond. I'm the Communications Specialist for the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program, which is centered here in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I'm going to be talking about our approach to effective climate change communications, and with the disclaimer that in the Park Service, we think every Park Service employee has a role to play with communicating climate change, but the audience that I work with the most are Park Service interpreters, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So my first question, so to do that, I felt like I needed to go back and talk a little bit about what interpretation is. Because oftentimes when I worked out in the park, and people would ask what I did for a living, I said, oh, I'm a Park Service interpreter. They'd say, oh, how many languages do you speak? So I thought maybe I would start back with, okay, what is interpretation and what is the role? Let's stay close. What is the role of interpreters in the Park Service? Can anyone tell me? Go ahead.
To help people understand
Absolutely, yes. So she said to help people understand what they're seeing and to get more out of the experience while they visit the park. So yes, that's pretty darn close. So really, interpretation is important to the Park Service because it helps support the mission of the Park Service to provide educational opportunities for our visitors, but also for the preservation goals that we have to preserve these beautiful places for future generations. And so parks, our national parks, that have the resources within them have meaning inherent in them. And when visitors come to the parks, they're seeking something of value for themselves in their park visit. And so interpretation really helps to facilitate the connection between the interests of the visitors and the meaning in the resource. And those meanings are going to be different for every single person that comes into the park. And the meanings are both the aha moments, those intellectual meanings of when somebody understands something for the first time, but there are also those oh my moments, those moments of feelings when they've been, when they're seeing something or feeling something for the first time. And so the stronger the meanings that are made, the more likely that people are to care. And this is really important for that stewardship goal that I mentioned. So that was just really quick, and I don't like to talk a lot about interpretation. I like to actually demonstrate it. So if you guys all have a pen, get your pen out, or if you don't, that's okay, but hold your pen. And I'm hoping to have a volunteer that would describe for me this pen as if you were describing it to someone who's never seen a pen before. Do I have a volunteer? I know, come on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm holding something, stick-like in my hand that's looking at plastic. It contains ink, and I use it with my writing hand to draw.
Okay. Did everyone, did people on the phone hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. So he's holding a stick-like thing in his hand that has ink in it. Mostly plastic, and he uses it with his right hand,
My writing hand.
his writing hand,
To draw or write words.
to draw or to write words. So
And it's about 6 inches long.
it's about 6 inches long. So that's a good description. Is there anything to add to that description?
I mean, could you say, I hold in my hand something that could be used for self-defense if I need it, because I don't... that kind of thing?
Yeah, because he's holding something in his hand that could be used for self-defense if he needed it. So, yeah, it could be. So that description is mostly the technical, the mechanics of what this pen is. But now I would like some volunteers to tell me what your pen means to you.
The way it's communicating, express your inward thoughts to somebody else. Wouldn't maybe to your
The way of communicating, a way to express your thoughts to others. What else does it mean?
Sometimes the actual making of the machine also is the sign of a back.
So the pen itself can have a meaning, but it was the pen that was used to sign the Wilderness Act. So,
It could be meaningless, because I've got 12 of these.
Exactly.
If I lose it, I don't care.
right,
Just that.
yeah. So it could be meaningless because we have lots of pens, and if you lose it, you have another one to replace it with. So, yeah.
This is the thing that leaks in the room and makes me shook.
It's the thing that leaked and ruined his Macy's shirt. So yeah, that has a lot of meaning. Yeah, so using the pen as a way to connect with your elders. Is that summary of it? So why do you think the responses are different between my first question and my second question? Okay, function versus value. And function, we all kind of agreed, yeah, that was a good description. But when I asked for meanings, everybody shared something that was very different to them about the meaning of their pen. So now I'd like to take this a step further, and I'd like to, you guys have to play along. I want you to, if you have a pen, hold the pen. Close your eyes, and I would like to share a quick story with you. So a man in his early 30s sits at a small writing desk late one evening. In his hand is a pen, and in front of him is a blank roll of parchment. He gazes distractedly at his reflection in the darkened window next to him, lit by the light of a single candle from his desk. A gentle but steady rain sends rivulets of water streaming down the window pane. His brow furrows with concentration as he turns his gaze to the paper before him and lifts his pen. His hand pauses for a moment, and his eyes focus on the pen held firmly between his fingers. He closes his eyes and takes a deep, slow breath, letting the gentle patter of the raindrops on the window calm him. He opens his eyes, presses the pen against the paper, and begins to write. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. Hours later, the man sits back in his chair, rubs his eyes at the hills of his hands. He looks down at the paper, now filled with the words that he suspects will soon change the fate of the world. Or at least the world he knows. He sets the pen gently on his desk, stands slowly, and gazes briefly on his reflection in a still darkened window before leaning down to blow out the candle. So the pen that you are now holding in your hand is the very pen that Thomas Jefferson used to write these words in June of 1776, as he wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. So what does this pen mean to you now?
I'm rich.
I'm rich is what he says. Any other thoughts? Might you treat the pen differently? No? Yeah, absolutely. I would too. So, these tangible resources that we have within the park, are really meaningful. And the context, being able to share the context with our visitors is a really powerful thing that as Park Service interpreters we aim to do. And this is very important as we start to communicate about climate change. It's critical as we start to communicate about climate change. Where the Park Service is coming up on our centennial anniversary, so in 2016, we will have been in existence for 100 years. And we've always had park interpreters out there striving to make these connections with our resources. And so what I do is I hope to empower our interpreters to build on the strengths that they have been taught, that they know how to do, and apply it to climate change. So that when visitors come to our parks and they see the wall of Fort Jefferson covered in seawater, that there's an interpreter or an interpretive product there that can provide that context to show that this is a fort that's on the edge of sea level rise with nowhere left to go. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us as a society? What will we lose if this fort is submerged in water? It's also for connecting when folks go to a park like Crater Lake, that has lots of snow in front of them, and they think, well, climate change isn't happening, look at all this snow. But having an interpreter there to show the trend over the years and the actual decrease that we're seeing in the snowpack in Crater Lake. And it's also important as we mitigate our own carbon footprint and become a more sustainable organization to have an interpreter out there talking about the steps the Park Service is taking to address our carbon footprint and showing that we're not doing it just haphazardly, that we have a reason for shuttle buses and the other practices that you'll see in national parks. So prior to 2009, the Park Service, I wonder too much, but this is a good tether for bringing me back. The Park Service did not have an official opinion about climate change. There were parks that were really out on the front lines of climate change, like Glacier National Park, Joshua Tree, the parks in Alaska, that were kind of talking about it, under the radar. But that all changed dramatically in 2009 with the appointment of our current director, Director John Jarvis. When he first took office, one of the very first things that he did, he was called before the Senate and asked to testify on how the Park Service was addressing climate change. And during that testimony, he said this: one of the most precious values of the national parks is their ability to teach us about ourselves and how we relate to the natural world. This important role may prove invaluable in the near future as we strive to understand and adapt to a changing climate. And when I hear that, when I read that, I can't help but see the role of interpreters within this statement. And, you know, we are really positioned very well to share a message on climate change. And as Sean articulated really well in his presentation, through these place-based principles, we have a lot of inherent strength to engage our visitors. And so I just want to run through some of those really quick. Again, we have tangible examples of this happening on the landscape. Our parks are laboratories for study, so we can engage our visitors in the citizen science activities that are so important for learning about this topic. Parks provide ecosystem services. We realize that we cannot address this alone, and we cannot address this just within the boundaries of our parks. We really need to look on a landscape scale and look beyond our boundaries and really engage our stakeholders in our communities, our local communities, for helping us to address climate change. We're a trusted messenger. People are likely to listen to a park ranger if we can provide an honest and safe place to have dialogue about this. We have a real potential to reach a percentage of this roughly 280 million visitors that come to parks each year. And we can also be a visible leader. Showing the actions that we are taking can be a great way to show others how to address this topic. So it was really interesting to hear some of the barriers that our staff have when communicating about climate change. And when I first started in my position with the program, I would get a call or an email almost every single day from a Park Service interpreter out there that would say, "Is it really true? Can you really talk about climate change?" And it was like, "Yes, it's true. You can talk about it. Please talk about it." And that was 3.5 years ago. We've come a long way since then. And part of what I do is really just empower our visitors, our interpreters, to say, we don't need to interpret from a place of fear with this topic. A lot of them were just really afraid that someone would know the science better than they did, or that there was going to be that one visitor that was going to argue with them in front of the crowd, and that we really don't have to do that anymore. We have a real strong place to stand when talking about climate change. So one of the things that we developed, we have a climate change response strategy document, and it has 4 areas of emphasis for how we're approaching this: the science, adaptation, mitigation, and communication. And within the communication section, we developed 4 key messages that were really, for the first time in writing, this is the Park Service's official position on climate change. And we put those in there to serve as a foundation. So as an interpreter, if you're just starting to talk about this for the first time, it's hard to separate your own opinions and values from that of the agency, of representing the uniform that you wear. And so we wanted to say, okay, if you start with these 4 key messages, you're starting in a good place, and you can always fall back to them if you need to. So these are our 4 key messages. Human activities are changing the Earth's climate. Climate change affects national parks and the treasures they protect. The Park Service is addressing climate change, and the choices you make today do make a difference. So building off of the key messages, building off of what we've learned with the surveys that were conducted, I've developed a couple of recommendations for our interpreters on how they can approach developing programs for climate change communication. So target your audience and tailor your message. Develop simple, clear messages that can be repeated often. And so this graph, people give me a hard time, but I really like it. On the left is our 4 key messages. And our key messages, there's one of science and urgency, one of relevancy, and 2 that are more focused around hope and action. And if you plot that against the audiences within the 6 Americas, it's been a way for me to develop recommendations for interpreters on specific messages that would target each one of these 6 Americas. And be a trusted source of information. Being trusted, being credible is trust times experience. And that's really important for our park rangers, because they're there in the parks, they have a lot of experience, and they're seen as a credible source. And actually, back in May 2011, we were able to work with the folks from the 6 Americas and we asked them to add the Park Service in their next survey. So they have a section in their surveys that asks, who do you trust the most as a source for information on global warming? And so you can see the Park Service is listed there. And this graph shows all of the different groups that were listed during that particular survey, and NPS is number 3. So NOAA and scientists tied for the first place, and we're just under those two. So this has been really empowering for our Park Service interpreters to say, wow, people actually are going to trust us when we talk to them about this topic. And actually, and I want to go back to the surveys that Sean talked about. Those have also been really empowering because we did not know the percentage of the 6 Americas that were coming to the parks. And in the interpreter's mind, that dismissive category was really large. And to see the results, that it's actually only 7% of the people who come to national parks, that has been really empowering to see that so many of our visitors are actually already concerned, already alarmed. They're ready to hear a message, and they're ready to know what they can do about it. And I was talking to our superintendent up at Kenai Fjords, and at Kenai Fjords, they have required that every interpreted program will have a climate change message within it. And most interpreters have said, okay, that's great, that's fine, but there have been a couple that have said, well, I'm not sure I'm really comfortable with this, and they went to the superintendent and said, why are you doing this? Why are you asking us to have climate change within every program? And he pulled out the survey results, and he said, well, look, 93% of our visitors are ready to hear a message on this. And if you tailor your programs to that 7%, look at how many people you're doing a disservice. So combined with the social science, both of the NSF project and with the 6 Americas, it's been very empowering for encouraging our interpreters to get out there and talk about this topic. And then lastly, the last recommendation, strive to activate people's experiential learning. Everyone learns both experientially and analytically, but experientially is really important with climate change. It can be gained in personal experience, witnessing an event when a trusted source tells you about it, or when a story is recounted to the audience. And in the parks, again, we have a real strength in that experiential because we have these examples right before people's eyes. And so this graph is really interesting. People who say they have personally experienced global warming. So the folks that are more likely to believe in global warming have said that they have personally experienced it. So it's a very powerful way to go about talking about this topic. So quickly, I just want to talk about a couple of products that I'm engaged in. We've developed a training course for our frontline interpreters specifically on how to interpret climate change in their parks. And it was initially a 4-day course, which with the time constraints and travel constraints in the Park Service, we've decided to try to teach this now virtually. And so our next training is going to be this coming May, the 7th to the 10th, and it's going to be an all online course. And we talk about both the science of climate change, the knowledge of the audience through the 6 Americas and the NSF project, but also we talk about those appropriate techniques that interpreters can use to be really engaging about this topic. We have a network of exhibits that are going in across the service in coastal parks, so it's going to address sea level rise. And then we have another series that will be going into parks that are talking about phenology. And the phenology ones are going to provide the same opportunities for visitors to upload their photos into a database to help us gather information on the changes that we're seeing on the landscapes in our parks. These exhibits are going to use QR codes. So if someone is standing at, in the Everglades down in Florida learning about sea level rise, they can scan the QR code and it can take them to the exhibit up in Kenai Fjords that will show them Exit Glacier and talk to them about glacier melt so they can see how one thing is affecting the other. And we should have some of these first exhibits on the ground this fall. We're also developing a series of videos, both science literacy videos that will talk about the specific science, climate science that's happening within parks, but we're also doing a series on park management. So our superintendents, with climate change, they're facing some really tough decisions, and just getting that out there to the public and saying, look, these are the decisions before us. We don't necessarily have answers yet, but this is what we're dealing with. Do you want to help? It's kind of a way for us to engage our public. And the first of these videos are done and will be posted to our website soon, hopefully. And then lastly, I think where we really are now with communicating about climate change is, we have interpreters out there doing it. They tend to keep their messages within the science. And everything that you read on social science, on communicating climate change, says it's really important to provide messages of action and messages of hope. And I think that that's kind of where we're getting stuck right now. We're having a hard time finding those messages of action that are really meaningful, more than just saying, change your light bulb. People say that doesn't represent the magnitude of this problem. So how can we make these messages of action a little more meaningful? And then the messages of hope. As our interpreters start to learn more about the science and they realize that the park that they work in, the place that they love, is going to change, they are finding it hard for themselves to find the hope. And so we're struggling with, how do we provide these messages? I was up at Glacier National Park doing our communicating climate change training for them, and a seasonal interpreter who had just started with the Park Service came up to me at one of the breaks and said, so I've been tasked with doing a climate change program. You said it's important to provide messages of hope, but how do I do that? And later in the day, we had a science panel, and the scientists kind of gave an overview of the climate science happening in Glacier. And at the end, I was able to ask, okay, knowing what you know about climate change, what gives you hope? And one of the scientists quickly, Dan Fabry, who's one of the USGS scientists, some of you might know, he just quickly said, well, I'll give you a quote from Winston Churchill that says, humans will eventually do the right thing when they've exhausted all other possibilities. and I like that. And he said, and I really think that we're going to get it together as a nation, as a world, and we're going to come together to address this topic. And I thought, that's really important. I agree with him, but I'm not sure that that's what gives me hope about this topic. And so I kind of went on, Operation Hope, and I don't have a lot of good suggestions other than it has to come from within you. It's a important thing for each of us to identify so that we can be sincere when we present these messages of hope. And I would love to have more of a conversation about this in particular afterwards, if you're willing. And here's just some examples that even the saddest chapters of human existence are often stories of human resilience and redemption. The Civil War and the slavery, the Trail of Tears, sovereignty, inequality, the Civil Rights Movement. With climate change, Everglades degradation, Everglades restoration, I don't know, it seems like there's some opportunities here for us to build out these messages of hope. And then lastly, my best advice for interpreters is just to get out there and do it. Even if it's interpretive dance, you can read all the social science, but until you get out there and actually do it and fail and learn from that and do it again, we don't have all the right answers for talking about climate change. So, thank you. Okay.
Hold your questions for Andy and we can address some of those at the end.
Hopefully this will work. Alright, so can everybody hear me okay in the back? I'll try to stay loud, but if not, somebody just do this in the back row. I'm very excited to be following Angie. I kind of feel like maybe we should have ended the thing just because I think it's really great to talk about these messages of hope. but hopefully it's a good transition to what I'll be presenting today, which is about National Wildlife Refuge visitors. And the goal there was to test kind of different message frames for different audiences, so I think it hopefully will follow up nicely. This is an entirely different project from what Sean was talking about earlier, but I think it's a great example of work being done with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So here we have the Director of Fish and Wildlife Service currently stating that science is climate change is unequivocal and we are going to do something and we need to be leaders on this issue now. So as Andy pointed out with the Park Service, this has kind of been a shift over the last few years, but it's something that needs to happen and the federal agencies are doing something about this. So there's been a number of different documents that are coming out where the agency, Fish and Wildlife Service, is wanting to adapt and mitigate to this. But of course we need to have the support of the visitors who are coming to these places, as Andy pointed out. So we know that visitors are a captive audience. They're coming to these lands to participate in wildlife and fish recreation. They're fishing, they're hunting, they're wildlife observing, trying to see birds, they participate in these things. They love these places. But we have kind of a limited knowledge of information regarding what they think about climate change and how involved are they in this particular issue. And how can Fish and Wildlife Service engage visitors when they're here on these lands. So we launched a study that had broad goals as well. So the broad goal of the study was to actually provide refuge managers, planners, and visitor services specialists with reliable data about visitors and then their refuge experiences. So this survey was much, much broader than just asking about climate change, but that was a piece of it that we really wanted to know about. So I'll give information about one portion of the study from 2010 to 2011. This was conducted in 2012 as well. So we conducted this survey on 53 refuges. We contacted over 14,000 people. So we have a data set of more than 10,000 people across the country. So this is the largest data set that the Fish and Wildlife Service has in relation to this topic. Sean pointed out it was specific to a couple different parks and refuges across the nation. Now we have broader information, but also a little bit narrow, because we did not ask the full suite of the 6 American questions. So we have 50% of these people did answer the survey online and by paper, so we gave multiple options for people to respond, hoping that that would increase the number of people who could give us information. And of course there's information online if you want to look up the national results, and each of these individual refuges also had results. So you can find out information about the climate change beliefs at each of these 53 stations. But in terms of the climate change questioning, we wanted to look at factors that influence people's climate change thoughts. So there's basic beliefs, their level of involvement of this, and then like policy preferences. These are the kind of things that influence people's thought about climate change. So we also wanted to test the framing of different climate change messages and how this resonates with different audiences. So, for instance, you can frame a climate change message about preserving nature for future generations to enjoy. Or it could be about maintaining tourist revenues, increasing the local economy, different ways, because different people, of course, will latch on to different ways of talking about this. So in terms of how we asked it on the survey itself, we just had a brief paragraph at the beginning, saying, obviously this topic's come up. We'd like to know what you think about it as it relates to fish, wildlife, and habitat specifically. So this is something different. We're not just interested in do you believe in climate change. We're interested in what their beliefs are in relation to the impacts on fish, wildlife, and habitat. So we have 3 personal involvement statements, one about desire for more information from refuges, and the beliefs about effects. So in terms of the national level data here, we have 71% that said they were personally concerned about the impact on fish, wildlife, and habitat. And we had a majority that said they stay well informed about this issue and that they take actions to alleviate the effects of climate change. So this sounds great, right? We have more than 50% who are on board. They stay well informed, they're doing things. But how does this actually relate to some of these message frames? Like, why is this not quite making a difference yet? So in terms of these visitors' beliefs about the effects of climate change, again, this is at the national level, there's 74% that think that future generations will benefit if we actually do something about these effects of climate change on fish, wildlife, and habitat. We also have 71% that think that it's important to consider the economic costs and benefits to local communities. And almost 69% also think that we can improve our quality of life if we address these
climate change effects. Almost half thought that there was too much scientific uncertainty to really understand the effects of climate change. So this is somewhat concerning here, right? Almost half of the visitor population thinks there's too much scientific uncertainty. However, 51% did disagree that there was too much emphasis on the catastrophic effects. So again, that's half the population. So some of the people are saying, no, like just keep talking to us about it. We want to know what the impacts are on fish, wildlife, and habitat. So this is great, but the reality is, of course, we have different audiences here. It's not just a national average visitor across the whole refuge system, right? We said we had 53 of these across this nation, 10,000 people. It's not just that easy to say 71% are doing something about this. So we wanted to do an audience identification similar to the Six Americas that you guys have been hearing about and obviously we're familiar with. However, we also had a 12-page survey, and we had about half of a page related to the climate change questions. You can't ask the full suite of the Six America questions. It wasn't possible for what our other objectives were for the survey. So we're thinking about how to do this. Can you segment along two different dimensions, right? We're talking about level of concern. We're talking about level of involvement. So in terms of level of concern, are these people aware of the topic and are they worried about it? And level of involvement, of course, is related to behaviors that we were talking about earlier. Are they actively seeking out information? Are they engaging in behaviors and supporting different policies? So if you think about condensing this into one segment on level of concern and level of involvement, you can have four different potential groups here. We can have somebody who's highly concerned and highly involved, and this would be an engaged group, right? So they're likely to support policies to alleviate climate change effects, and they're going to actively perform mitigating behaviors. We can also have somebody with high concern but low involvement, right? So they're getting the information out there, but they're just not doing anything yet. So then we can, of course, have the low concern, low involvement, and this would be the detached group. They have little interest in the topic, and they're not doing anything, not supporting policies, and not supporting behaviors. Then we have the dismissive group, which could have low concern but high involvement. So these are people who are actively seeking out information purely to refute it. And they're not performing any of the behaviors or supporting any policies. So just to quickly go through, so I'm going to label these kind of, the engaged groups are already doing stuff, right? We wouldn't say that we don't need to worry about them, but they're saying that they're doing stuff. So in terms of communication, we don't need to actively seek out communicating with this group because they're already doing things. The green here for this highly concerned, these are people, again, who are concerned, but they're not doing anything. So this is a group that we'd likely want to target because they could be moved into this engaged group. All we need to do is get them to start doing things. So I'm going to go green for the rest of this. We have yellow for detached. This is kind of in between. They're not really paying attention and they're not doing anything. So the communication strategies for this group will look a little bit different. And the dismissive group, as I said, this is a problematic group for people who are trying to communicate because they're going to listen to you, again, to argue with you. So we'll keep red as the theme to go throughout the results here. So in terms of these items, I ran a cluster analysis to look at how the visitor population broke out in these four groups. So we have, again, like an engaged group that clearly on a scale of 1 to 5, on a 4.8 on a scale of 5, they're very personally concerned. They stay well informed, they take action, and they are interested in the refuges providing information to them. The concern group, so the engaged group is almost 40% of the visitor population as a whole. The concern group is about a fourth of the population, and these are, again, they're personally concerned, but now we're getting around the neutral, or closer to the neutral line for staying well informed and taking action. But they are interested in the refuges providing information. They're saying that their experiences will be enhanced, that the refuge provides information on how they can alleviate climate change effects. So again, at the national level for the detached group, we have about a fourth of the population that falls into this category. So again, it's still around the neutral line for personal concerns, staying well informed, taking action, but a little bit on the positive line. This is what you were talking about earlier with the social bias. They're saying, oh, yeah, sure, I pay attention because if you ask, you shall receive, right? But they're saying that their experience is it starts to decline here, so they're not quite sure if their experience will be enhanced, so they're not quite sure how that information is going to benefit their recreation activities on these lands. So the dismissive group here, again, we're saying they're not concerned. On a scale of 1 to 5, this is the lowest of the groups. And again, they're on above the neutral line on staying well informed. and they're saying they do not take action, and then the experience definitely will not be enhanced. So, like, they don't want to talk about the subject when they're out trying to recreate. So in terms of different message frames, how these message frames will resonate with these different groups. So these are people who either agree or disagree with each of these different types. So here we have three different groups, engaged, concerned, and detached, that with the message frame of improving our quality of life and future generations will benefit if we address the effects of climate change. So clearly these groups are accepting of these kind of message frames. So if we're communicating with people when they come to these public lands, they want to hear these kind of stories. And if you can make it personal to them, that makes a big difference. You know, if it's impacting their children or their grandchildren or their communities, you know, this again it's important when it's about the individuals and the people and the places that they're connected to. So in terms of the economic costs and benefits to local communities, this one's a little tricky because it is cost and benefits. So of course you're going to have the dismissive group who's going to focus in on what these costs are to the local communities versus the other groups, you know, they may be focusing on the benefits. But the point is they want these things addressed. So each of the audiences all agreed with this. They had a majority of, sorry, I shouldn't say that. They had a majority of that type that bought into this message frame. In terms of the catastrophic effects, now this becomes interesting in terms of the detached and dismissive group. So 50%, and in the case of the dismissive group, almost 90% of them felt that that there were too much focus on the catastrophic effects. So for this group, if they hear this kind of message frame, they're tuning out, they're done, they're not paying attention anymore. And same with concerned, detached, and dismissive. This is a little disconcerting for somebody who loves science and likes to talk about it. But this is a group that thinks that there's too much scientific uncertainty to understand this topic. And so again, subjects that are like, oh, you know, species are declining, the world's collapsing, any of this kind of stuff, they're not going to necessarily believe you. So anytime that you're mentioning something like this, that will tune out these audiences. So that becomes a concern for any of us who are trying to communicate with people when they're coming to these lands. So in terms of what does this mean for these local places, you know, once people are coming to these refuges, can we identify particular locations where there are certain types of audiences? So for the most engaged, again, out of the 53 refuges, these 4 were the top refuges where the most engaged people went. So 62% of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge's visitors in Oregon fell into this most engaged group. So Sunny Bono fell into in California, Bombay Hook in Massachusetts, and Necedah in Wisconsin. So again, these have half of the visitors who are saying they're falling into this engaged group. So this is a great location to actually start doing these behaviors at the refuge. We don't really necessarily need their buy-in at this point because they've bought in already. They want to start doing stuff. They're saying they're doing stuff. Let's give them the opportunity to do it. In terms of the most concerned, these are locations, again, where they're not necessarily participating, but they're paying attention. And so these are locations where communication could really potentially shift this group into the more engaged. Can we make this tangible behaviors that they can participate in? So for the next options, we have the most detached and most dismissive. And so if anybody is noticing some of the locations too, some of this is regionally based, right? So in the Pacific Northwest and in the Northeast, we had a high percentage of people that were falling into this engaged and concerned group. Once we get into detached, it does change a little bit. So for the detached groups, again, I mean, these are people where it's a little bit more, less tangible in terms of how these communication efforts might come out. So in like Pine Creek, Charles M. Russell, Reelfoot, and the Gregor District, we have over a third of the refuge visitors who fell into this detached group. So it's important to understand what it is at these places that, you know, people are obviously coming here. So if they're caring about these lands, can we talk about it in a way that makes it real to them for where they are? So again, in the most dismissive group, we have some locations here, which almost a fifth of it. So 1 out of every 5 visitors that come to these places would fall into the most, would be dismissive. So this is a place, again, where if you're providing this information, it may backfire. So that becomes interesting in terms of how you would want to communicate when people are coming on the site. But again, these people do care about these places, and they do care about the future generations, so it's important to make it in a context of where they'll talk about it. So you may not, again, you're not trying to say that climate change isn't happening, but maybe just framing it in a completely different way, where you're talking about the things that people do care about. So, as Angie said in one of her recommendations, it's incredibly important to know your audience, know the different messages that you have, and then tying this together. So if you have an audience in a particular place, what kind of message is going to get the type of activity that you need them to participate in? So which messages resonate with which of your different audiences? And so I would love to open it up to questions for the whole group. There's been a lot of different information given to you guys today, and I would love to invite you guys back up here too, or just start a discussion with everyone about the information that has been presented. So.
Anybody have any specifics for media first, and then, what's it up to everybody else?
Yeah, definitely.
If you have your phone and you brush through them, are there really, it feels like maybe they're really different from each other, and then I have if you have a particular strategy per web page. Is that correct?
Yes. In some places, of course, there's a mix, diverse of, audience types. But there are definitely clear places where we can start doing things. It's not as clear a thing like, all refuges in the Northwest are going to be a certain way. Deer Flat was one that is right on the border of Idaho and Washington, I believe, or Oregon, somewhere right in that area. And they're very much local visitors, and they very much didn't buy into the engaged, or they didn't fall into the engaged group. Sorry. Yes, yeah. So it's very interesting in terms of, it goes back to what we were talking earlier about how the place space really makes a difference. It really depends on, one, how far visitors are coming to get to a place. So somewhere like National Elk Refuge or like Yellowstone National Park, where people are traveling from potentially all over the world. And so, in places where there are more local visitors, can we do something, again, not necessarily denying that we're trying to do something about climate change, but how can we connect to the audiences who are coming to these places?
So is that pretty closely? Close by audiences and for
It depends on where in the country. Yeah, so I would not feel comfortable saying that. So.